Hi, welcome to these series of sessions on conducting impactful literature reviews. This series will focus on how you go about identifying a suitable topic for your review. How do you motivate this review? How do you conduct the search in terms of developing a robust search protocol? How do you then go about identifying the key literature, reviewing this, synthesizing the findings, and presenting an impactful literature review which clearly calls out either a conceptual framework or sets a future research agenda. Now, the first of these series of 5 to 6 sessions will focus on setting the motivation for the review in terms of how do you motivate your review, and that eventually sets the stage for the rest of your review paper. Now, even before we start, right, it's very important that we understand what a literature review should actually be doing. Now, first and foremost, literature reviews can actually get cited, and they kind of paint a picture of what is happening uh, in your field of research. But more importantly, it's important that you suggest certain possible avenues for research, like say put forth a set of research propositions based on what you've reviewed, or even propose a new conceptual model after you've synthesized the literature that has been reviewed as part of the study. But just as much as these research propositions or conceptual models are important, it's also important that you kind of steer clear of being too descriptive in a review. It can be quite tempting because you've read through these several articles, 50 or more, and you may want to talk about them, but then being too descriptive is 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 not really advisable because it kind of misses the plot in terms of putting forth research propositions or conceptual models or kind of setting a future research agenda. Uh, More important, all through, you want to keep coming back and asking yourself, how do I make use of this review to chart the future research for this particular domain or any specific topic that you've chosen as part of the review? When we talk of reviews, literature reviews, you will find there are several forms. Uh, for academic purposes, what you see on the slide is the top four, or rather four broad areas of reviews, starting with narrative reviews, developmental, cumulative, and aggregative. Narrative reviews, for example, if I have to just pick on that, is when you pretty much don't have the time or resources to search through the entire body of knowledge that has happened in your field. That's when you pick on some of these narrative reviews. You may want to just read through that so you quickly are able to grasp what has happened so far in your field. But our focus predominantly through the rest of these sessions will be on aggregative reviews, where we will look at, say, something like a systematic review, meta-analysis, and so on. What does what do some of these reviews do? We will get to that in a bit. But more importantly, when you decide on a particular review, it's important that you weigh in certain aspects in terms of the suitability of this particular review for whatever you are researching, reviewing. Is that review appropriate to answer the research questions that you've put forth? And what do you intend to gain out of doing this review? So keep going back to those questions, and that will kind of help you understand, or rather even substantiate, whether you've chosen the right form of review for your study. Okay, like I said, we get deep into some of the reviews. Now, formally, what is an SLR, or a systematic literature review? As per Paris and Beachy 2013, page 378, they define an SLR as a replicable, scientific, and transparent process that aims to mitigate bias through exhaustive literature searches and providing an audit trail of the conclusions. I would like you to pay some attention to this replicability, scientific, transparency, and the audit trail. What it primarily means is If someone else was to actually were to do this review again, most of the findings, or rather the approach, the process you've taken should be replicable, right? So if they were to follow the same search protocol, if the time frame, and be able to conduct through the similar databases, they should be able to get similar outputs by following that process. So there should be absolute transparency in terms of whatever you've actually done, and you should be able to trace back the conclusions to what you've reviewed. So that audit trail of the conclusions is extremely important. So what I intend to say in summary is it should be an explicit, reproducible methodology, and that's very crucial when you're doing an SLR study. Now, within this aspect, there are broadly three kinds of reviews. The first is a domain-based review. The second is a theory-based and a methods-based. We will kind of deep dive and look at each of these in detail. But it's important to note that there's this paper by Paul and Criado 2020, which calls out that there are several domain-based, but not as many well-crafted theory and method-based reviews. That's also an opportunity for you to look at how a theory has been used in a particular field, or kind of look at how a method has been applied, and be able to review that in whatever is your chosen field of study. Now, when is an SLR apt and when it isn't? There's this very interesting paper by Paul et al. 2021 where they call out that SLRs are apt when there is there are several articles that have been published in your domain, when at least there are 40 articles for review, right? So a lot of work has already happened in this domain. That's when an SLR is really apt. And there hasn't been any SLR in the domain in the recent years, at least. Sometimes this is a little hard to find. Um, Within the last 5 years, at least, there shouldn't have been any SLR in this domain. And more so, one does not exist in some of these high quality journals like the ABS and the ABDC ranked top rated journals. And existing reviews, even if they have been done, there are several shortcomings of these reviews and several gaps, glaring gaps that seem evident when you look at some of these reviews. So that's where an SLR would be most apt, is uh, is the what is stated within this article by Paul et al. 2021. Now, we looked at a few of these things. So let's just go back, right? So there are gaps, there are short changes. That's what we said in the last line. Now, if there is a gap, it's very important that you call out how your review intends to fill those gaps. That's very essential. Uh, like we said in the previous slide, an SLR might not be very valuable early on, right? So the field is just developing. There aren't many studies in this domain. Now, choosing an SLR as your option may not be the best way to go about things, especially if it's in a very nascent stage. And it would also be inappropriate if this research question is too vague or broad. Now, your research question is so broad that you do uh, you design your search protocol and run the search, you will get like hundreds of different articles, right? That's extremely difficult for you to synthesize as part of an SLR study. But even if the question is too narrow, right? So what you end up with is just about 20 or even lesser. An SLR may not really make any sense with 20 or fewer studies. Now, you got to strike this balance. Um, and I would urge you to kind of look at this JBR article, the Journal of Business Research article that's there on your right, where it also it's a very nice article which kind of calls out clearly what are some of the existing SLRs, what are some of the problems with these SLRs, what do we answer through our SLR, and what is the novelty of what they do. So I would urge you to go look at this article. It's a very well written article, and that may give you some further advice in terms of how you can craft your reviews. Well, given that we are in the age of AI, there are several of these uh, discussions in terms of how Gen AI can actually help you with reviews and all of that. There are, and if you will scan through the, um, the internet, there are several of these tools that have been developed for reviews. But they tend to compromise quality. And like these authors here point out, right, when it comes to explainability and transparency, it can actually make things a little difficult. It's important that as early scholars, we go and deep dive into the literature, read through these documents, because a literature review is only one of the first few steps towards developing further studies like empirical ones. It's important that you set the stage for some of these future studies by scanning through the literature. AI can only do so much. And if you look at some of the recent tools as well, it's debatable. There are ways it can help, but as these authors call out, it can actually even compromise quality. If you want to go back and be able to explain some of these things, be as transparent as possible, it's hard. All said and done, if you're using an AI tool, when you're actually submitting to journals and conferences, it's important that you be transparent about what you've used and how you've used that tool as part of your entire study, depending on what is permitted and what is not permitted and all of that. So I think that is important for you to kind of weigh in and kind of look at and comply by the rules and regulations. Now, domain-based reviews, right? Something called a structured review, where the focus is on the widely used methods, theories, constructs. This is where you will find these kind of reviews, structured reviews. You'll find a lot of tables and uh, content that's organized across these reviews. Because what will happen is, if you have to just look at some of these examples, right, you will see that, okay, OLS regression, there are 127 instances of OLS regression used in the papers. These are some of the key references. Say co-integration analysis, there are 28 instances of this analysis being used, and these are some of the references. What are the DVs, as in the dependent variables? What are some of the IVs? And what are some of the countries which have looked at FDI research? So some of these structured reviews are full of tables, and they literally talk about what has happened in that particular field. Now, there's this is another one you might want to get into and look at. There's another one called framework-based reviews. There are some very popular frameworks like the ADO, the antecedents, decisions, and outcome, or the 6W framework: who, when, where, how, what, why, and the TCCM. I've put in some references that you can go back and look at. But what do these say, right? So when you talk about antecedents, outcomes, and decisions, you're primarily looking at the articles as part of your review and clearly identifying what the antecedents have been, what are some of the outcomes, what are some of the decisions that are incorporated within these articles that you've reviewed. And when we look at these 6W framework, uh, it primarily talks about what should happen as part of a literature review. So who conducted this research? When was this data collected? Where was the data collected? How, how did you go about finding this data? What did you find after you've done this? And why were these specific works selected as part of your final data set? So that's important. I've put in the references here so you can go back and look at them. There's also something called TCCM, where you're looking at the theories that have been dealt with in this particular domain, some of the constructs, characteristics, and methodologies. So this is another way to kind of structure your reviews when you're looking at us applying a certain framework and doing your review. And like we said, right, it's important that you encapsulate, you organize what you found. For example, in this article that you see, table 3, what are the theories that have been used? There are 36 articles that actually use social identity theory. There are 15 of them which use users and gratification theory. What are the industries that these studies are focused on? There are several of them that are focused on retail, the context, right? The TCCM, the context, and characteristics, which is where looking at some of the IVs, some of the DVs, and the methods as well, which talking about, say, something like, say, what methods have been used, like structural equational modeling, regression, correlation, how many of these studies have looked at specific methods, so on and so forth. And more importantly, even when you're using the TCCM, it's important that you set a, a future research agenda based on each of them. When you're looking at theories, there are a certain set of research questions that you can actually put forth. When looking at context, That's another place where you can actually look at how some research questions could be developed based on the context that you've studied, the characteristics or methods, in terms of, say, putting forth certain research questions which are very methods oriented based on whatever you have reviewed. There is yet another form that's called bibliometric reviews, which is primarily intended at highlighting trends, what are citations, how are the authors and co-authors linked across papers in terms of collaborations, the country level details, the theories or research problems that have been studied, and that is like you see, you will see some of these depictions in some of the bibliometric reviews. There are a few that I've actually put here for your reference. Now, the intent of these reviews, and when you look at some that have been published over the years, is they will specifically focus on a journal, just to kind of carve out or present what has been the themes that a particular journal has actually focused on over the years, and capturing certain trends. Now, this helps you understand the focus areas of a particular journal and how it has progressed over the years. So that's typically some of the key reviews that have been published over the years. Presented a few examples to your to the right of the slide that you can go and look into understanding of what's happening within some of these bibliometric analysis. Now, a hybrid review, where what do you do within a hybrid review? One approach would be to bring in some of these frameworks, which is primarily focused on setting a future research agenda, with another kind of a review, which is a narrative oriented review. Another approach would be to kind of bring together a bibliometric and a structured review as part of your hybrid reviews, which is where you're combining two of these approaches. If you remember, in a few slides back in this session, we looked at two other kinds of reviews that have not been dealt with as much as the domain based reviews. The first is the theory based reviews. Like you see on the slide from the example, what does this article that was published in JAMS, Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, talk about? It predominantly, or rather, it just focuses on resource based theory in marketing. It just looks at what has been the theory's application in marketing, and it looks at all the studies that have used this theory, RBT, and how the theory has been applied, and so on and so forth. That's a great way to put forth a perspective on how a theory has been applied in a particular domain. And you may want to consider some of these depending on what is appropriate and what is the need of the hour. But when you're writing some of these theory-based reviews, I think it's important that you exercise caution when you're critiquing a theoretical perspective, like you see here, right? So there is a very important statement that the author makes, saying agency theory is an important yet controversial theory. Now, you got to be very sure when you're making some of these statements. So I would urge you to be absolutely strong in terms of whatever you've reviewed, and be able to make and your comments, or rather your narrative, should be in such a way that uh, it is measured and it's appropriate for whatever is the theory that you're reviewing. There's yet another aspect, the third of them, from the domain and theory and the methods based reviews, where you're looking at a particular method and how the method has been applied in a particular field. Like when you're looking at this similar, the same journal JAMS, which talks about event study methodology in the marketing literature. Now, what they do here is they review the manner in which event studies have been used, and they just summarize what has happened as far as how these event studies have been designed and how they've been interpreted within the marketing domain. So that's what they focus on. There's yet another one where they're looking at discriminant validity testing in marketing. Now, again, what they do here is they look at how the method has been applied, and uh, is there any cause for concern and any potential remedies that could be looked at. Okay, when we talk about method, it's important that you differentiate what a method is and what a methodology is. Now, the image on your right is pretty much self-explanatory. It gives you a clear perspective of what methodology is, which is cutting across the rows or the blocks that you see here, whereas the method is sitting somewhere here. Now, a methodology, as the description on the left goes, it focuses on the description, the explanation, the justification, and evaluation of this entire process of scientific inquiry that you're going about. Now, methods are typically the rules and procedures, the technical rules and procedures that you use for collecting your data, analyzing this data. So data collection, data analysis, that's where your methods resides. The methodology literally cuts across the entire set of steps as part of your review. Okay, now setting the stage for the review, motivating your review, that's very essential. Now, I believe there are four key steps that you need to pay attention to. One is to define the concepts. To be able to substantiate, why do you need this review? Why do you need a standalone literature review? Why can't you just do with an empirical paper or something else? You must be able to review past literature if there have been any other reviews that have been conducted and what have their shortcomings been. And then also be able to talk about the research question. Be very specific in terms of putting forth your research question because they direct your overall study design and also kind of set the stage for the rest of the review in terms of how you select the literature and the subsequent analysis. Topic analysis. It's a very interesting paper, Davis et al. 2012. You can go into it and look into it in detail. Um, in terms of how you go about choosing a particular topic. But beyond that, it's important that you even define the concepts that are in focus. Now, in this article, the key concepts are fake news and hospitality. It's important that you define fake news and also scope out what is included and excluded as part of the hospitality industry that you're looking at fake news in. So that's essential for you to call out. Now, this is a review that was published in MIS Quarterly. IT dependent strategic initiatives. That's the key construct. And if you look at the first page, they clearly define what an IT dependent strategic initiative is. And that sets the stage for the rest of the review. So defining these concepts, which is the focus of your review, must be first and foremost at the outset. You got to define this. Moving on, what is the need for a standalone literature review? So what is the value that you are bringing in through this review? For this to be absolutely strong, you must have a good sense of what has happened in the past reviews. So conduct a review of the past reviews and then call out the value of a current review. Now, I would like you to pay attention to some of these highlighted words, right? So they say here that the past reviews have overlooked the ecosystem as a whole, and they then substantiate the value of the current review. So they say that yet how IT, especially the contemporary form, digital technology, has been rarely examined directly. And then they say, I attempt to solve the part whole imbalance problem in this paper. So that's very essential for you to kind of, that helps you motivate the problem better because you've clearly called out some of the shortcomings of past reviews. Best, even better would be to kind of just summarize them in a table, what the past reviews are focused on and what are some of the shortcomings. So that kind of it makes it easier for the reader to even capture the essence of what you're trying to um, talk through. Like here, what do? We focus on, when we talk about past reviews, we focus on what are the focal themes of the past review. So say um, one of the papers is actually one of the reviews have actually focused on sustainability and innovations. Another one has just focused on sustainability. Most of them have focused on sustainability innovations over here, and so on. So, given that there are three focal themes: fake news, sustainability, innovation. So, which of them are focused on sustainability innovation? There's hardly any that is focused on fake news, which is where we call out the need for a standalone review. So that's the way. That's another way to kind of substantiate or rather justify the need for this standalone review. Like for example, over here, when we focus on a specific theory, right? So we're saying that, okay, there are all these other past papers that have used SST or social shaping of technology theory in a different context. Now, what does this paper do? So we utilize social shaping of technology theory to develop a comprehensive perspective on how deepfakes have evolved and so on and so forth. Okay, now that you've defined the constructs, you've called out the shortcomings of prior reviews, it's time to present your research question. And when you're presenting your research question, it's important that you justify the choice of review, right? So we are saying that we use an SLR or we use an integrative review or something else. It's important to substantiate why an SLR is best suited for this review or why an integrative review or a critical review is best suited for answering these research questions. And make sure that you also highlight how your manuscript overall, the review, how does it address these research questions? Some of the examples that you see here on the right, that's where the authors talk about what does this do, why is SLR the best possible review choice of review for this particular research questions, and what does the review do, and how does it go about addressing the research questions that have been put forth. And when you're using something like a TCCM, the theory, context, characteristics, methods framework, it may become even more obvious and you may be much more precise, right? When stating research objectives. So we understand the theories, we identify and examine the context, we understand the characteristics and identify the methods. So it clearly maps to the framework that you used in the paper. So, and that flows down, cascades into the research objectives. It's important that because we're talking about two things here, right? So research questions and research objectives. It's important that you understand the differences between an RQ and an RO, research question and an objective, right? So when you talk about research questions, they generally tend to be open-ended. Research objectives are very specific, right? It's very clear, precise to the point. Research questions, they focus on the main problem within the study. But research objectives, again, going back to the specificity, they define the specific outcomes that you intend to achieve through the review. Research questions may also be a good way to kind of define the scope of the study, but research objectives, they help you with the process, they guide the research process. Now, they are not mutually exclusive, right? So when you talk about research questions and objectives, it is best if they can flow from one to the other. So if your objectives could be derived from your research questions, nothing like it. Now, for example, over here, RQ1 and RQ2, there is a way in which you can actually map it out to the research objectives, and you can observe it closely. You will be able to see that because, for example, in RQ1, you're talking about theories, research context, characteristics, and methods. If you closely observe RO1A to RO1D, it talks about the TCCM, and you're identifying the methods, you're understanding the characteristics, so on and so forth. Okay, that pretty much brings us to the end of session one. If you are already writing a review or in the process of doing one, you may want to go back, use some of the uh, discussion points that we spoke about in this session to rewrite your motivation. Go back and look at the motivation that you've written for the literature review. Think if you want to make some changes there. You may also, if you've already chosen a particular form of review, you may want to justify this or even identify if that's not the case, then you may want to identify what's the most appropriate type of review for your topic and look at your research question. Go and reread your research question. If you think there is an opportunity to rewrite it, go for it. So once you've done this, right, a brief checklist to go back at the introduction, read through it. First of all, understand or check for yourself if you've justified the need for the current review. What is the contribution that your review is making? Now, look at your research question, read it, reread it to understand whether it's clear, it's well motivated based on whatever is the preceding paragraphs that will lead to the research question. Understand whether you have reviewed the past reviews, and have you been able to call out shortcomings, gaps, and you're able to account for the past reviews. Have you called out your approach very clearly in terms of what is the choice of method, how do you go about it, and all of that? And have you been able to justify that this is the best approach to address your research question? So, to close the session, a quick recap. What did we do? Irrespective of what review you've chosen to go with, it's important that you define the concepts, the constructs that you are embarking on as part of the review. Define the concepts upfront. Justify this need for a standalone review. Discuss what prior reviews have talked about. Highlight some of the gaps and shortcomings. Specify the research questions. Be very accurate, and also discuss how your review addresses the research questions that you've proposed. Thank you.